Good day, everyone. Welcome to the One Open Door podcast. My name is David McKay. This is a place for talks and conversations about Zen awareness practice and about how to embody that practice right here, right now, in this very world we live in. I hope you enjoy the experience. Before I get on to the podcast proper today, I have a bit of a disclaimer that I want to say. And here's what it is. By and large, what I'm talking about on this podcast is on a process level. And what I mean by that is the stuff that's happening independent of the various circumstances of our lives, of the various content areas of our lives. So that would be, how conditioned mind works, the various patterns and processes that go on there, how to let go of conditioned mind, how to end suffering, how to live free from conditioned mind and be a happy human on this earth, stuff like that. And with that kind of stuff, I've been looking at that, working on that, letting go of, the suffering aspects of that, learning how to be happy and at peace and in a state of well-being and all of that myself for many years. And I feel a great sense of confidence and how much you might say sort of authority around those kinds of topics. And that's partly because of, all the experience I have with it, and also because those are the sorts of things that anyone who takes the time and has the attention to look deeply at will see. They're universal truths on a psychological level, you could say. They're universal truths, in other words. There's things, anybody who looks will see what I've seen, I think, because what I'm talking about there is just how things are. And so when I'm talking about those things, I feel like I don't need any particular disclaimer because, as I said, I think anybody who looks will see the same things I've seen. When I get into, and this doesn't happen very often, but it's going to happen in this program, when I get into things on the content level, however, then that's different. This podcast comes out of a conversation I had with a young woman recently who is interested in having children and asked me for if I had opinions on the subject. And I have very heartfelt opinions on the subject. But what I said to her is what I'm going to say to you too, which is the opinions I have on the subject are just that. They're just one person's opinion. I would imagine that, many people would disagree with what I'll say about that. And that's fine. That's fine with me. And that's just the way it is on a content level, because on a content level, there is no universal truth, I think. It's just, everybody has their own individual perspective based on their experience and, what they see, where they are in their lives, the cultural context they come out of, all that kind of stuff. And so what I'm going to do in this podcast is I'm going to start off with the process stuff. I have a bunch of things about wanting and different things, wanting and having, that I want to discuss with you. So all of that is in that category of stuff that I feel really confident in and have a sense of authority around even. But when I get to the part at the end, when I'm offering my opinions about, bringing children into this world, then I just want you to take it with a grain of salt and know that, everybody has to form their own opinions about that and get to a place of peace and clarity around that, if that's something they want to do. And not to take anything I say in that regard with any sort of authority, because as I said, it's just one person's opinion. And the reason that's important for me to say is, you can't, to bring a child into this earth, into this world is a huge decision on all kinds of levels, I think. And, whoever decides to do that needs to accept the karma of that. They need to take responsibility for that and make a clear, conscious decision on their own. And they need to not just go, follow somebody else's point of view and figure they're right and just do what they think. Okay? So anyway, there you go. There's your disclaimer. And now on to the program. To begin today, I have a question for you. See what comes up for you when I ask you this question. If you consider all the different reasons and motivations for what people do and what they attempt to acquire for themselves, What do you feel like is the very worst reason to do anything or acquire something? Out of all the different motivations we have, what's the worst one that calls us to action of different sorts? If you feel like, you might even pause the podcast for just a moment and just think about that for a second, or even write it down. What do you feel like is the very worst one? When I attempt to answer that question for myself, it seems to me like there's several really good candidates for the worst human motivator. But here would be my answer, at least today. See what you think of this. The worst reason to do anything is because I want to. The worst reason to acquire something is because I want it. So see what you think of that. What comes up for you when I say that? Of course, that flies in the face of everything that we're taught and all the cultural conditioning we receive, it seems to me. Because within the cultural conditioning that we all carry, what I want is the most important thing in the universe. So much so, it seems to me, just, looking at my own conditioning and looking to see how other people do what they do. If I want something and I can't have it for some reason, then I think most people go to, well, there's something wrong then. There's something wrong with the universe, or there's something wrong with me often because, we tend to blame ourselves for things like that in our conditioning. But I think that's a fundamental assumption that we have, that what I want is the most important thing in the world. And that is the most logical, reasonable, just obvious motivation to do anything. But of course, that presents a tremendous problem for us, which is generally when people are doing, quote, what I want to, or they are choosing to have something or some experience because they want it, because they're telling themselves they want it. The problem with that is, in general, people are identified with a conditioned, separate self. And it's that self that is wanting the thing. And when a self is wanting something, and if we go along with that self in order to have that thing, we may or may not get the thing. Often, if we have the means, we will have it. We'll be able to get the thing. But what we'll get in addition is a self, is an ego. And that, to me, is the worst thing that anybody could possibly have. It seems to me, in fact, that one way to explain all of the chaos and trouble and difficulty, including things like prejudice, unfairness, violence, war, and in particular, the environmental devastation that is happening to the planet right now, everything really that human beings suffer unnecessarily, at the heart of it is an ego that wants what it wants. And along with that ego that wants what it wants is a human being that cannot see ego and assumes that ego is who they are, and so is just unconsciously going along, doing whatever ego is telling it to do, telling the person to do, and getting whatever the ego says it wants to have. And of course that produces a selfishness and self-centeredness, because that's what ego is selfishness and self-centeredness, and causes people to act from a place of selfishness and self-centeredness without regard for the impact and consequences of their actions on others around them and on the planet. I think if you look at the state of humanity now and the state of our planet, and you follow that thread of selfishness back to each individual person who was acting from that place, you'll find the cause. Imagine a world in which nobody is identified with ego and acting from ego and trying to give ego what it wants. What would a world be like? It's hard to know exactly, but not like this. Not like this. I don't think we would live in a world where there's violence and prejudice and unfairness and racial subjugation and all those kind of things. I don't think we live in a world where we're willing to devastate the planet that we live on in order to have what we want. I think all of that would disappear. That's why I feel like I can say that because I want to, or because I want it, is the worst and most unhappy, most devastating motivation that a person can act from. Okay, so the question that naturally arises from that is all wanting bad? Am I saying that we need to get rid of all wanting and just not want anything? And to me, the answer to that is no, not at all. There's a place from which we can want things naturally, from a place of clarity, in a way that doesn't support ego. And that's what I want to unpack at the beginning of this podcast. I want to get into the weeds of that and see what's the difference between the sort of wanting that is unhelpful to the point of being devastating, I think, on our planet. What's the difference between that and the sort of wanting that's good and wholesome and actually is desirable, is a good thing to have? So let's unpack that here over the next little while. To begin, let's look at the sort of wanting that is the troublesome kind, the kind of wanting that produces ego. And let's look to see what can we see about that? What can we, if we really look at that and look at what it is, what do we become aware of in terms of how that works and what's problematic about it? The first thing that comes to mind to me is the second noble truth of the Buddha. I would imagine that many of you are aware that kind of the fundamental teachings of the Buddha is called the Four Noble Truths. The first noble truth says essentially that we have the capacity to suffer. And the second noble truth is the cause of suffering. And the cause of suffering is typically translated as desire. So we suffer, the cause of our suffering is that we desire things. And to me, there's a way in which that's true. But there's a way in which that's a little bit misleading. And I want to explain what I mean by that. And I want to explain it with the help of, I'm going to read you something that kind of unpacks that a little bit, and then I have a few comments. So I'm going to read you something from a book called Thoughts Without a Thinker by a fellow named Mark Epstein, or Epstein, I'm not sure which. And I don't know anything about this fellow other than he wrote this book. It's an interesting book, though. He's a psychologist trained in the Western tradition who is also a Buddhist practitioner. And I'm not that far into the book, but it's good so far. He's explaining kind of the different approaches, psychological approaches that are taught in the West as opposed to what the Buddha taught in terms of our human psychology. And I want to read you, he's talking about the Four Noble Truths, and he's talking about suffering. And just let me read this and see what you think. He says, the Buddha gave his first teachings in a deer park in a village known today as Sarnath, outside the ancient Indian city of Benares, to an audience of 5 ascetics with whom he had practiced before his realization. It was as if he was testing his ability to explain his understanding to his old friends and fellow renunciates from whom he had earlier broken. And this is a quote. Now this, brothers, is the noble truth of suffering, he proclaimed. And then he went on to say, birth is suffering, decay is suffering, disease is suffering, death is suffering, sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair are suffering. To be united with the unpleasant is suffering. To be separated from the pleasant is suffering. Not to get what one desires is suffering. In brief, the 5 aggregates of attachment are suffering. And when he's talking about the 5 aggregates of attachment there, it's one of my favorite teachings of the Buddha, actually. It helps to explain how it is that the illusion of a separate self is created. There's these 5 things, and they happen to be our body, our sensations, our perceptions, our mental formations, and our capacity for consciousness. Like all these things come together to create the illusion of a separate self. So he's saying that all of those things come together, and when they come together to produce that self, then that's what we call suffering. So anyway, the author goes on to say, while, quote, suffering, end quote, is the conventional translation for the Buddha's word dukkha, it does not really do the word justice. A more specific translation would be something on the order of, quote, pervasive unsatisfactoriness, end quote. The Buddha is speaking on a number of levels here. Life, he says, is filled with a sense of pervasive unsatisfactoriness, stemming from at least three sources. First, physical illness and mental anguish are inescapable phenomena in our lives. Old age, sickness, and death clash with our wishful fantasies of immortality and therefore contribute to our sense of dissatisfaction. Second, our own likes and dislikes contribute to the sense of dukkha. Not to obtain what one desires causes dissatisfaction. Being stuck with what one does not desire causes dissatisfaction. And being separated from what one cherishes causes dissatisfaction. Third, our own personalities contribute to this general sense of unease. As many a psychotherapist can testify, and as the Buddha so clearly recognized, our own selves can feel somehow unsatisfactory to us. We are all touched by a gnawing sense of imperfection, insubstantiality, uncertainty, or unrest, and we all long for a magical resolution of that dis-ease, so dis/ease. Dis-ease, I guess it would be. We are all touched by a gnawing sense of imperfection, insubstantiality, uncertainty, or unrest, and we all long for a magical resolution of that dis-ease. From the very beginning, the human infant is vulnerable to an unfathomable anxiety that survives in the adult as a sense of futility or as a feeling of unreality. Hovering between two opposing fears, one of isolation and the other of dissolution or merger, we are never certain of where we stand. We search for definition either in independence or in relationship, but the ground always feels as if it is being pulled out from beneath our feet. Our identity is never as fixed as we think it should be. So what he doesn't say there, but what is implied is that, because of this sense of disease and this sense of anxiety, and because of our, the fact that we have a body and we're dependent on certain things in order to get what we need and survive in this world, we feel the need, this is what we're taught in our conditioning to do, we feel the need to form an identity that feels safe and secure, and to inhabit that identity. This is the person I should be, this is the person I am this person. And that is what we kind of set up to sort of counterbalance this, the fact that we are vulnerable, that we could die at any moment, that we're completely dependent on our environment and the world we live in and other people in order to survive in this world. And so we create an identity to be in order to avoid having to feel that fear and anxiety, and to substitute kind of a sense of stability and security instead. And then we go about trying to acquire things and experiences that reinforce that identity, that reinforce that sense of self. And if you look at why people do what they do, I think, seems to me anyway, see what you think, that's why people do what they do. I mean, that's not why people say they're doing what they're doing. What they're saying is, well, I'm doing this because I want to do it, like I was saying earlier, and I am going after this thing because I want it. But what they're really doing it on a process level underneath is they want the thing or they want the experience because that validates a sense of ego. That validates the identity that wants that thing. So if what do I want? I want a new car, let's say. Well, why do I want the new car? Well, maybe I need a car. I mean, there certainly could be legitimate reasons for that. But when we're in a conditioned place and doing a conditioned process, the process of suffering that he's talking about here, the process of dissatisfaction, then I want the car not because of the car, but because I want it. I want it because I want it. Because that identity is formed around wanting something. And if I sort of indulge that sense of wanting, then I am ratifying, almost you could say reifying that identity. And that creates, this place that I can be in where I feel safe and secure. The problem with that is that there's no reality in identity. There's nothing true in it. It's a false thing. It's an empty shell, kind of pretending to be a person. And that's any identity. It doesn't matter what the identity is. We all have actually a collection of identities that we go in and out of, and there's kind of a core identity that we call me, that all those sub-identities are a part of. But none of that stuff has any reality. It's all made up. It's all fictional. Those are all fictional selves that we inhabit because we don't know how to just be in life unfolding without being a self having an experience. So in other words, we go around trying to acquire things and acquire experiences to ratify, reify this identity that we want to be, that we feel like that we need to be, and that we believe that we are. But the problem is that can't work. That can't possibly work. That has never worked for any human from the beginning of time, because there's no reality in identity. And so we end up trying to create and maintain this thing that has no real substance. And so we end up feeling dissatisfied. And also, underneath that, afraid. And then, we bounce off that fear, and then we look for the next thing to acquire or consume or whatever, in a sort of a never-ending attempt to escape from our fears into some place where we can just let go into unconsciousness and not be aware of what's really going on, and not be aware of what's really going on inside of us. So that to me is what the Buddha is pointing to when he's talking about, again, and this is an inadequate translation, but when he's saying that the cause of our suffering is desire. If we look underneath that, the cause of our suffering is we become a self that desires. And that desire is a mechanism, as I've been saying, to sort of support the illusion of that self. Okay then, so what's the alternative to that? That's what we need to get to. If that's the problem, what's the solution? It's interesting because I actually read what I just read to you last night in group. We have this virtual group that we do every Thursday and Sunday at 7 Eastern. If you want to participate, just let me know. But in those groups, we talk about stuff like this. And last night I read to the folks who showed up in the group, what I read to you, and we had a very interesting conversation about this whole thing, about what I like to call the process of dissatisfaction, and how that's created and maintained, and what the alternatives are and stuff. And one person in the group said a very interesting thing. She talked about, she was camping actually at the beach, and she went out to meditate in the morning, and it happened to be that there was a high wind. It was, she said it was probably like 30 miles an hour. And so, the wind was picking up the sand and was sort of pelting her with sand while she was trying to sit. And so, most people I think would say, hey, this is not good, this is not pleasant, I'm not doing this. But she decided she just wanted to experiment with that and see what it was like just to sit with that, with those circumstances, even though a lot of people would say, these are not good circumstances. This is not what I want to do. And what she described was an experience of being able to be in herself, connected with herself, in a place of centered awareness, where she's having the experience of the wind and being pelted by the sand, and it's getting in her eyes and in her mouth and everything, and yet having no resistance to that, having no preferences in a way, not preferring to not have that happening, but really just accepting that that's happening, and being, with herself in it. And the word she used to describe that, which I found to be very interesting, is consistency. Like there's a certain consistency in her inward experience if she can be present and not in a conditioned self, which was what was happening, I think, in her experience. Other words that she didn't use that came to my mind were words like strength, stability, groundedness, stuff like that. And what we talked about after she described that to us was that there is this place within us that we can go where the fear that I was talking about earlier and that Mark Epstein is describing in this book, the fear and anxiety that comes from the fact that we're animals with bodies and completely vulnerable and could die at any moment and dependent on the world that we live in and other people and our environment, that whole thing, where we are not subject to that fear or anxiety. And the reason we are not subject to that fear and anxiety is because we are not a self. It takes a self to experience fear. It takes a self to experience anxiety. If you're not a self, those things do not apply because there is nobody there to experience dissolution, to experience what from inside of a self looks like and all this really terrible bad stuff that could happen. If we're not being a self, there's only one other place we can be, which is to be in presence, in centered awareness, or another way to say it is to be our authentic nature. From that place, the kind of fear that we're talking about here does not apply because there's nobody there to experience that fear. And that, I feel like, is what she was describing when she was talking about sitting in those circumstances. So that to me is the alternative. There is, in my direct experience, and likely in yours too, there is this place of centered, disidentified, so not identified, not in identity, place of pure awareness that we can inhabit where we, as I've said in many places and in previous podcasts, where we are just life unfolding without the sort of desire that is problematic that I described earlier, because we don't need anything in that place. We don't need anything in that place to support ego because we are not in a place of ego. We don't need to acquire things in order to give ego a sense of itself or experiences, to give the ego a sense of itself. We're not being ego, and so we don't need to ratify or reify ego. And so there's no dissatisfaction. In that place, again, in my experience, and likely in yours too, there is this unconditional satisfaction with life, even if things are challenging and difficult, even if we're not getting particularly what we need in any moment, and certainly if we're not getting what ego wants. Because what ego wants is not what we need. That's what it wants and what it feels like it needs for itself, as I've been saying, to support itself and to maintain the illusion of itself. In this place of centered awareness, those things don't apply. And so what is there instead is an experience of unconditional satisfaction, and peace and joy and gratitude and those kind of things. Again, even if there's something difficult going on, maybe there's, I'm having some kind of struggle in my relationship, or things in my work life are kind of getting squirrely or, unraveling or something like that. And there's stuff I'm working through. But from in this place of centered compassionate awareness, I can work through those things without the dis-ease that is in what I read to you earlier, because I'm there and I'm present with myself. Okay, enough of that. So let's get back to the wanting thing. And let's head towards the sort of wanting that is not problematic and that doesn't support ego. So the next thing I want to lay out for you is something that I found to be very helpful over time, particularly since I left the monastery. And I'm gonna make some distinctions and divide things up in a certain way. Here's another qualifier for you, though. And this, I tend to say this thing often in various contexts just because it's good to remember. When we divide things up in the way that I'm going to divide them up, it's good to remember that these divisions are arbitrary and don't have objective reality in them. In reality, all is one. And so when we divide things up, we're creating fictional divisions that don't have ultimate truth in them. But it's helpful, actually. I find it to be helpful to make these kind of distinctions because it just helps us to see things in different ways. In order to compare and contrast things, you have to divide them up. So you have things to compare and contrast, and it's really helpful to compare and contrast things just because it gives us different points of view. So as an analogy, let's say I've got a motor of some kind, and I want to figure out how that motor works. Well, I can look at the motor as one thing. It is one thing. In a sense, it is one thing, but it also has all these parts. And so it's also helpful to divide up, say, oh, that's the carburetor, and that's the exhaust manifold, and, that's the drivetrain, or, whatever it might be. And to look at it as these different parts and look at the function of the different parts and see how they work together to create the whole. So just like that, I find it to be really helpful to divide up the sort of different kind of processes and patterns and things that are happening in our minds, compare them and contrast them, see how they work together to produce suffering, to produce the illusion of a self, and also to, potentially to produce a life that works, that's healthy and centered and good, that doesn't support ego. Okay, so there's a qualifier for you. So here's the distinction I want to make. I feel like one useful way to divide up our experience is in 3 categories. The first category is just the pure human aspect of our experience. The part when I say, we're animals with bodies, that part. Okay, and I'll say more about that in a minute. So that's one division that we can be. So we are humans, we are animals with bodies. That's one aspect of our experience. The second category is another place we can reside, as I've been saying, is in a place of centered, compassionate awareness. And in that place, we're not particularly having a human experience. We're having a transcendent experience. We're having the experience of transcending our human experience, of transcending the fact, in a certain sense, that we are an animal, that we have needs and that kind of thing. And then the third place that we can end up is in conditioned mind. And then, so conditioned mind is this false sense of what's happening. It's the place when we go into our heads and we get lost in ideas and concepts and assumptions and beliefs about the way things are. That's the other place we can be. Okay, so then to summarize that, we have our natural human experience. Our natural experience is animals with bodies living on this earth. We have this transcendent possibility of centered compassion and awareness that comes from these minds that we have that have the capacity to step out of our purely animal experience into this larger place. And then we have this thing that we call conditioned mind, which takes the capacity that we have to step out of our natural, you might say, human nature, and instead of going to a place of transcendent awareness, going to a place of limited self-consciousness. So those are the 3 places. So for me, when I look at my own experience over time, and also when I look at just people, and of course I talk to a lot of people about practice over the course of any given day and any given week, I look at how people live their lives and what's going on. It appears to me that, and I would say this about myself when I began, before I started doing practice, and also for a long time after I started doing practice, by and large, people are living in category 3. They are in conditioned mind, being itself, surviving life, basically. And I'm not going to go more deeply into that right now because, I do that all the time. And it's in lots of other, things that I've said or written or other podcasts that I've done recently. But what I will say about that is that seems to be the normal sort of place for a human being to reside. It certainly does not seem to me that it's common for people to be residing in a place of centered compassion awareness. And interestingly, it does not seem to me that it's common for people to be residing naturally in their authentic human experience. Instead, they are separate from their human experience, being this fictional, artificial self who is having the experience and is dominating the experience and is, as I was saying earlier, basically kind of steering the boat, taking it wherever it feels like it needs to go to make sure that its identity, its sense of self is maintained. Okay, so that's where we start. That's certainly where I started, and it seems to me that's where just about everybody starts. So what happens through practice over time, and this is over time, this is hard work that takes an incredible amount of dedication and courage and determination over time, okay? But over time, what happens for a person, and I've experienced this in myself to some degree, is that they move out of identification with conditioned mind and begin to have the other two experiences. They begin to have natural, authentic experiences of just being a human being, and without being separate from that, without being separate from their, the five aggregates, the body that they have, the sensations that are going on, the perceptions and mental formations that are happening, and the sense of consciousness or awareness that is incorporating all of that. So they are, they more and more have the ability to just be in that natural state, having those things happen, but without identifying with a self that that's happening to. And simultaneously, and the reason it's simultaneous is because you have to have this, the second, in order to have the first. Simultaneously, they also have experiences of, you might say, identifying with or becoming or embodying the awareness that, to me, is what we most fundamentally and essentially are, that is holding the human experience. So for someone who is not in conditioned mind, to me, that is what's happening, or that's what is, at least potentially, what potentially can happen, is that there's the human experience, and then that experience is being held in a place of consciousness and awareness. That's what we're going for, I think. I mean, it's a beautiful thing to be able to simply embody our natural human experience, and a lot of people will idealize that. Actually, it's like it's kind of like a back to nature kind of thing, or back to childhood kind of thing that people will idealize. It's like, wow, if I could just get back to that state. Like I actually had a conversation recently. I was at it's kind of a get together. It's not enough people to call it a party, but just sort of this get together. It's one of my, as I've mentioned in other places, is one of my practice challenges after being a monk for all those years, is to be in different kinds of social settings and to learn how to be myself, my authentic self in those settings. So anyway, I was at this place and I was talking with someone, and we weren't actually talking about spiritual things, but she just came out with this. But basically what she said is, gosh, like what would it take to get back to this state of innocence that I had when I was a kid? I feel so like disjointed and disoriented and confused all the time and unhappy, and I would just so much like to get back to that place of innocence where all that wasn't happening. And I actually, in the circumstances were happening, I wasn't really in a position to say anything about that. But what I thought about it was, well, that's not what we're going for. I don't feel like that's what I'm going for, and I don't idealize that at all, because I don't want to go back to a place of presence without awareness. I mean, if I had to choose between being in a place of presence and being conditioned mind, in a place of self-consciousness instead of awareness, that's a no-brainer. I would be in a place of presence without awareness any day of the week, any day of the year. But that's not what I idealize. What I want for myself is to be in a place of presence with awareness. And that's what it feels like can happen over time. We start off as little kids in a place of pure presence without awareness, it seems to me. We move into a place of conditioned mind. I think, I've never met anybody that hasn't happened to, other than people who don't have the mental capacity because there's something not quite right with their brains. But other than that, anybody who has normal brain power, they start off in a place of innocence. They move into conditioned mind. They identify with conditioned mind, go into survival. Most people stay in that place for the remainder of their lives and die in a state where they're identified with conditioned mind, it seems to me, except for occasional glimpses of the other possibility. But the other thing that can happen is someone who wakes up to the fact that that's happening and then receives the teachings that can help them understand what's happening, and has the willingness and the courage to do a practice that carries them out of an identification with conditioned mind, what will happen for that person is they move back into a place of presence, but with awareness. See, it's just so beautiful the way this is set up for us as human beings, because it all works. I mean, and it works. The process involves tremendous amount of suffering and pain. Lord knows I've experienced tremendous amount of suffering and pain going through this, and I've been very fortunate. I mean, I was not, sort of unusually traumatized as a kid or anything like that, but still a tremendous amount of suffering and pain and all of that. But it's beautiful the way it sets up, because for a person who's willing to go through that, they come out the other side back into a place of presence and awareness. And I experienced that in my life. Not all the time, as I always say, it's a work in progress, but that is something that happens in my life and that I'm so incredibly deeply grateful for. So anyway, the possibility that is here for us is to have both, I think. And one's not better than the other. Sometimes people, when I say stuff like this, people get the idea that I'm saying that, that a place of centered awareness is better than being in a place of presence and embodying our natural human animal nature. And I don't think it's better. I think that I would say, this is a place where it's just one person's opinion, but I would say the place of centered awareness is more fundamental in a certain sense. It's more essential, but not better. But the beautiful thing about being who we are as human beings is we have the capacity for both. And so if we let go of conditioned mind, we get to be a human who has needs, who lives in a certain place geographically in this world, has a body, and that body has certain characteristics. Not everybody has the same kind of body. So that body has certain characteristics. And with a certain natural mind. Not every mind is the same either, as I'm sure you've noticed. I mean, an example of that I always go to is there's this fellow at the monastery who I trained with, who was this brilliant artist. I mean, it was unbelievable what this guy could do. I mean, he could just look at something and draw it as if it was a photograph with almost no effort. I even saw him for this event that we did. He did this painting on a 4x8 piece of plywood, a huge thing. It was absolutely beautiful, and he right before it was time for him to do this painting, I can't remember what happened, he fell or something, and he hurt his left hand, I hurt his right hand, and he was right-handed, and he painted the whole thing left-handed. And it was stunning. It was, unbelievable. So he had this certain kind of mind that enabled him to do that was not the kind of mind that I had. And then linguistically, it was obvious that his mind was different from mine. We didn't put things together the same way. And again, one's not better than the other. I admired very much the artistic sort of mind that he had that enabled him to do that kind of thing. But I also appreciated my own, I didn't have that, but I have a very sort of logical, linguistic sort of mind that's really good at seeing patterns and processes and that kind of thing. And I really appreciate that in myself. But at any rate, people have different kinds of minds. So people have different kinds of bodies. They have different kinds of minds. And so, when we let go of conditioned mind, we get to have our natural mind. And we get to embody our body and have a human experience on this earth. And just because we have this capacity, we also get to hold that experience of being a human being in conscious centered awareness if we choose and if we have a practice that develops that capacity, which is extremely difficult to accomplish and enables us to live in as a human being on this earth from a place of centered awareness. Okay, so what does that have to do with wanting? Well, from the place of the authentic human place I'm talking about, we're naturally going to want all kinds of things. We can't help but want all kinds of things because we have bodies. At the very least, we're going to want food. When we need it too. We're going to want and need food and shelter. I would add to that list meaningful relationships, good, healthy, meaningful relationships. I would even add to that meaningful work or a way to make a contribution in this world. I think a lot of people would throw in, and I'm one of those, fun, joy, happiness, love. all those things, the desire for those things, it seems to me, come as part of our sort of fundamental equipment as human beings on this earth. And there's nothing wrong at all with those things. Quite the opposite. I would say those are good, beautiful things. Those are God-given, if you want to say it in a theistic way. And the other thing I would throw in that list, and this is a place of, great controversy over time, especially in the West, is our sexuality. There's nothing wrong with that either. To desire sexual expression, to desire to have sexual connection with others, I think is a good, beautiful, God-given thing if it's not being used. And this applies to everything else content-wise that might come into our experience, if it's not being used by conditioned mind to create the illusion of a separate self and cause us to suffer in the way that I've been talking about and describing. And so there's nothing in the world wrong with wanting things from that authentic human place. And there's also nothing wrong with having things. That came up in the conversation in group last night too. Somebody was like, well, are you saying that, that we shouldn't have things? I was like, no, there's nothing wrong in the world with having things. It's beautiful and good to have things. As long as having things, again, we're not using the things we have in order to support ego and its sense of separate self. Now, for me, I feel like there's a certain kind of responsibility to look to see, well, what's the best for all? And, does it make sense for me to have this thing in the context of this world that we live in? And, there's certain limited resources. And, if I acquire this thing, what impact does that have on my fellow humans here and elsewhere in the world? And that kind of thing. That just seems necessary if we're going to take full responsibility for our actions. But apart from that, given that, if we assume that whatever thing that I want kind of passes the test in that regard, and I feel like, no, this is a perfectly reasonable, good thing to want, and it fits within, this world we live in, there's nothing in the world wrong with having things, as well as with wanting things. Or, to say the same thing with different language, the trouble with wanting things comes with attachment to them. And why is that? Well, because when we attach to things, it's because we have become an ego. An ego is the only entity that is going to attach to things. If I'm in the place of being a natural human, in the way that I'm talking about, I'm going to want things when I'm not going to be attached to them. In the sense that if I don't get this, then that means whatever. That means I'm not a good enough person. I haven't done it right. I don't deserve to have good things, or, all the stuff that comes up, the kind of different beliefs and assumptions that support an ego. From a natural human place, I'm going to want the thing. And if I don't get it, there may be consequences. If I don't get, if I miss a meal, if I don't get food, I'm going to be hungry, and that's going to hurt. If I miss 2 or 3 meals, that's going to hurt even more. If I love someone and they don't love me in return, that's going to hurt. But I'm not going to be attached in the sense that my sense of identity is at stake. I'm just going to be a human animal who is experiencing the consequences of receiving what I want and what I need, and of not receiving what I want and what I need. Okay, so I think that's all I need to say right now about wanting. So the reason I went through all of that was to get to the place where I can say, the reason to want to bring a child into this earth because I want to is a terrible, almost tragic reason to create a human being to live and to go through life in this world. So again, this is the place where you have to start taking things with a grain of salt, okay? This is a place where this is just one person's opinion. But, I don't know, I feel it feels helpful to offer the opinions. So I'm going to offer opinions about that. So I think a lot of times that is the reason why people have children, because I want to, or some variation on that. Like, the other one that's just kind of hideous to consider is, well, let's have kids because that's going to help our marriage. Oh my God, like that's shocking that somebody would make that decision from that place. And the reason is because, and I don't blame anybody who has. So if you're somebody who's made a decision from that place, don't don't take this hard, okay? Because, if you don't know, you don't know. We act from whatever level of consciousness we have, and then, if we look back and realize we've done something unskillful, even on this scale, we have to forgive ourselves and then, do whatever we can to, to become more conscious. But anyway, the reason why, to me, that's such a tragic thing is because, as we've all experienced, to be a human being involves tremendous amounts of pain and suffering. And that pain and suffering is unnecessary. If that person does not exist, that pain and suffering does not happen. And so to bring a person into this world to experience pain and suffering, to me, involves a tremendous amount of responsibility, and is not a decision that should be taken lightly. As a matter of fact, that ranks up there. Can we say that is perhaps the most important, or not important, but consequential decision that a person can make? I don't know. Maybe there's candidates for other ones that have that much, that level of consequence, but there's not many. It's way up there at any rate. So I think a person needs to go through a process of deep discernment before they choose to do something like that, to bring a child in this earth, just because, the pain and the suffering and everything that's going to result is going to be huge. And also because, by and large, most people don't make it through this life with having escaped from that pain and suffering to any degree. Most people, unfortunately, make it through this life still very much in their identified with the conditioned self and suffering over that. And that's hideous. Now, on the other side, of course, this is a very beautiful world that we live in. And being a human being involves a tremendous opportunity to wake up and end suffering. And then, as I've been saying elsewhere in this podcast, to experience life from center. Wow, what an exquisite, amazing opportunity to have. Something to be profoundly grateful for. And so there's both sides. So of course, I wouldn't say at all that, well, we all need to stop having children just because, it's inevitable that people are going to experience pain and suffering, because the other possibility is there too. But I feel like, it needs to be set up so that the person who's born into this world at least has a decent chance of getting the good stuff and not just the bad stuff for their entire lives. And so to me, if someone wants to bring a child into this earth, to me, they need to be called to do that. And when I say called, I kind of mean in the Christian sense. You know how Christians will talk about that. I've always really enjoyed that language, actually. That I'm called to do things. It's like God is calling me to do this. This is beyond my own will. Like, this has that level of importance. It seems to me that for someone to choose to have a child on this earth, they need to be called to it. It's like, this is what I'm here to do. Not, this is what everybody else is doing. Oh my gosh, what a horrible place to make that decision from. What an unconscious place to make that decision from. This is what everybody else is doing. Well, I guess this is what I should do. No, to make a decision with this much consequence, as I was saying, from a place that's so casual and with so little discernment, seems just completely irresponsible to me. So I feel like a person needs to be called to it. And also, I feel like a person needs to be in a position to actually provide a healthy, loving environment for that child to be raised in. Because that's what's required. If a child is not raised in a healthy, loving environment, the chances of that person, when they grow up, the chances that they will have the willingness and the capacity to do the work that I've been describing in this podcast and elsewhere, to wake up and end suffering and move to a place of centered awareness, is very, very low. Now, it's not non-existent, I don't think. I think there are people who they're just ripe and they're ready and they are able to overcome, a level of trauma that I didn't experience, and do the work of waking up and in suffering and be successful to a large degree at that. I think that does happen, but I think it's rare. For anybody to wake up and in suffering to any degree is rare, but somebody who has experienced that level of trauma, I think it's really, really rare. So I would propose that what's needed for in the environment, the holding environment of a child, is love, is unconditional love. Now, does anybody get that perfectly? No. I don't think that ever happened. Well, I don't know. Maybe it just happened once or twice in the history of humanity, or maybe, I think I'm exaggerating perhaps, but not often, hardly ever. But the degree to which that is there, that there is real unconditional love and acceptance for the child, and a willingness to allow that person, as they grow up, to be whoever they are, the extent to which that is the extent to which that person has access, I feel like, to the possibility that I've been describing in this podcast of going beyond conditioned mind and living a beautiful human life from center. And just as an aside, is this what I'm saying now has become very apparent to me over the past year and a half or so since I met my friend Kathleen, who I spend a lot of time with these days, because I feel like she lives very much in a place of centered awareness often. And part of that, I think, is just all the work she's done in her life, which has been big. She's done a lot of work in her life within the circumstances that she's been given. And also, she was raised she tells me, in a loving, healthy environment. And so she started off as a young woman, after she left home, with a sort of self-confidence and self-assurance and self-love that a lot of us didn't have, And I put myself in that category too, to some degree. There was genuine love in my house. There's also, there's some other stuff that was not that happening there because of, the relationship that my parents had and, all that kind of stuff. But I had love too, and I think that has been a large factor in my own capacity to do this work and wake up and end suffering in my life. So anyway, it seems to me that a person needs to be called to be a parent. A certain person needs to have the capacity, provide that healthy, loving environment for the child to grow up in. And what's required for that person to have that capacity is they have to have worked through their own stuff to some degree. They have to have some level of consciousness and awareness. Not perfect, of course, because, if it was necessary for a person to become, an enlightened being before anybody had children, then, the race would die out in the next generation, because that never happens. But to have some degree of awareness, some significant willingness to work through their stuff within the capacity of being a parent, I think is crucial. And the other thing that's required is, a marriage, assuming that the child is being raised by two people, which of course doesn't happen a lot of times these days, but, assuming that's happening, a marriage that is healthy and good and full of love. Because if the marriage is not healthy, or partnership, doesn't have to be a marriage, but if the marriage or partnership is not healthy and good, and if the two people who are becoming the parents are not able to be with themselves and each other in a centered, compassionate way a lot, and are able to work through whatever differences and difficulties they run into in a centered, grown-up way, then there's no way they're going to be able to raise their child with that kind of health and love, because if it's not there between them, it's not going to be there between them and their child. So, if a person or two people are in a position to raise a healthy child with love, and if they are called to do that, that's what they want to give their lives to, because of course it involves tremendous amounts of sacrifice. I see it happen, especially with wealthier folks, where, a child is born and then the parents essentially are not willing to give up what their egos want, and they end up pursuing what their egos want and ignoring the child, and maybe even paying somebody else to raise the child for them. It just seems so sad to me that happens in this world. So if people are truly called to it and are willing to make the sacrifices and put in the time and attention, I think it's a beautiful thing. I think it's a beautiful thing to want to raise a healthy child on this helpful person in this world who has the capacity to truly and deeply experience life and truly and deeply love and be here and get to experience this amazing world we live in. I think it's the most beautiful thing there is. It is, and as I've been saying, I feel like it's tragic to bring a child up in a way that is where they essentially have no real opportunity or no reasonable opportunity to have that experience and essentially instead doomed to live in conditioned mind their whole lives and suffer. And then one more thing about this that I'll throw in, and then I'll let you go. Obviously, we don't need more people. I think a good argument could be made that, I'm far from being an expert in these kind of things, but just from what I see, a good argument could be made that our number one problem on this earth is that we've overpopulated it. There's way, way, way too many of us, and there's way too much of a demand on the earth's resources. We don't need more people. We need a lot less people, actually. And then there's this bizarre thing happening right now in the news where, in first world countries, people are deciding more and more not to have children. And so the population is actually declining. And people are freaking out about that because, that's going to make the economy tank. And what are we going to do as we grow old? Who's going to do all the work and who's going to take care of us and that kind of thing. And while I can be sympathetic to that point of view, it's like, it just seems bizarre to me. I mean, basically what that comes down to is I'm just putting my own selfish needs above the good of the planet, and it just seems bizarre and unhelpful. What we need, I feel like, is for the population to decline. And I don't know what people would say, experts would say is the right number, but at least half, maybe a quarter. I mean, I really have no idea, but a lot less than we have now. And we need to let that happen. And, if that's going to happen, that's going to require tremendous sacrifice from those of us who are here. And I'll throw myself in that lot. Like for somebody to say, well, I'm going to, and I think governments are doing this now where they're putting incentives in place to get people to have more children. Like, we're going to do that basically so that we get to maintain our self-indulgent lifestyles when we get old? Really? That just seems completely misguided to me. It seems instead what we need to do is bond together as a species and say, hey, we're willing to do without so that we can get this thing back on track, so that there's not so much suffering in the world, and so that the people who come after us will have the resources they need in order to live good and healthy lives on this earth. That just seems to me just a no-brainer in terms of acting from the place that's most compassionate for all, which, I've said in many other places, is the place I feel like we all need to be acting from all the time if we are going to create a world that's, that's a happy one, and at peace, and that is worth living in as humans. So anyway, there you go. There's one person's opinion about that topic. Thank you so much for your time and attention. Thank you if you've made it this far. Thank you for being present with this and for listening and taking this in. Thank you for your practice. Thank you to whatever extent you are attempting to be the best person you can be, the deepest, wisest, most present, most compassionate person on this earth. Thank you for that. And thank you for all you're doing to be that for others in this world as well. Take care, be well, and we'll talk with you again soon.